I used to believe that the bond between a parent and child was unbreakable, that nothing could sever the love I poured into raising my son. It was a conviction born of all those nights I held him after nightmares, those afternoons I spent cheering him from the sidelines at youth soccer games, and the countless hours I devoted to guiding him through life's pitfalls. I never imagined that one day he would look at me, see my home as a mere obstacle, and try to push me out to satisfy his own ambitions. But reality can twist our cherished notions into unimaginable shapes. I write these words now from the comfort of a recliner I once believed would always bring me solace, even in old age. Yet everything changed when Michael decided that my home, my sanctuary, had more value to him as a stepping stone than a place where his mother should be allowed to remain. From the beginning, I had my suspicions that his new relationship with Alicia was bringing out an unfamiliar side of him. He'd grown distant, curt on the phone. He stopped dropping by except on major holidays, and even then, he'd show up with a forced smile that never reached his eyes. My birthday came and went with no visit, just a card bearing only his signature and a quick, "Love you, Mom." I tried not to read too much into it, attributing the changes to normal growth and the pressure of adulthood. He had a new fiancée, a new job, and maybe new interests. It would be unfair to cling too tightly to the hope he'd remain the sweet boy I remembered. At first, I attributed my worries to that empty nester anxiety many parents experience. I remember pacing in the hallway, noticing how quiet the house was without him around. I told myself that he was simply busy, living his own life, and that was perfectly normal. Of course, he wouldn't call every day. He had college loans, a demanding schedule, and a fiancée to keep happy. All of this, I kept repeating, was part of him maturing. My friends tried to reassure me. "He'll come around," they said. "Kids always realize how much they need you eventually." I wanted to believe it, but as time went on, my optimism began to fracture. He'd show up unannounced with Alicia in tow, as though making a perfunctory stop. He would barely say hello before he'd start wandering around the house with an analytical look on his face. I'd catch him measuring walls or corners, scribbling notes into his phone's notepad. When I asked him what he was doing, he'd just shrug and say something about interior design, or how maybe one day he'd like to have a house just like mine. But bigger, of course. There was a strange discomfort in his eyes whenever I tried to push for clarity. One Sunday, not too long after he and Alicia became engaged, Michael invited me to dinner at a fancy restaurant downtown. He said he had something important to discuss. My heart fluttered with excitement and trepidation. The kid who rarely had time to see me was inviting me out. This had to be good news, right? Maybe he was finally realizing that he missed me or wanted to reconnect. Perhaps there was a baby on the way. I prepared for anything and arrived at the restaurant early, wearing a new dress and trying to keep my hopes in check. When he and Alicia sat me down, they didn't waste any time. Michael's words still echo in my head. "Mom, we've been thinking a lot about our future. We want to start a family soon, but we need a bigger house in a better neighborhood. And since you live all alone and your house has appreciated in value, we thought you'd be open to selling it and downsizing. You could move into a nice condo, and Alicia and I could take over the mortgage on your place. Or maybe we'd just flip it, then buy something that suits our needs." At that moment, I felt time slow. I kept waiting for them to laugh or say they were joking, but their expressions remained solemn. My throat went dry. Words failed me. It wasn't that I was resistant to the idea of them buying a home or wanting something bigger. What broke my heart was their cavalier approach to my life, my memories, my house, and the very place I had lived for decades. Couldn't they see how callous it was to ask me to hand it over? They framed it as though they were doing me a favor, as though I was a feeble old woman in dire need of rescuing. But I knew exactly what they wanted. They saw my home as a commodity, an asset that would spare them from a hefty down payment on a better property elsewhere. I remember trembling hands as I reached for my water glass. Finally, I managed to speak. "That's my home," I said, voice quivering. "I've spent half my life making it perfect, fixing the garden, remodeling the kitchen, making it a welcoming place for you and your friends. I'm not a piece of luggage you can move around at will." Alicia responded by putting on her sweetest smile. "But Mom," she cooed, "this is such a good deal for you. We know a realtor who can find you a lovely condo. You'll have less to manage, less to worry about. Wouldn't that be nice?" My gaze locked onto Michael's. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. He was too busy fiddling with his napkin. I felt a mix of rage and sorrow crash over me. Where had the boy who once baked cookies with me gone? The one who tearfully clung to me whenever he got bruises on the playground? It was like staring at a stranger. I tried to remain composed, finishing the meal in silence while Alicia prattled on about potential neighborhoods and how children thrived better in certain school districts. She name-dropped a few places where all the best people were moving. None of it felt real. I nodded without absorbing a word. The next day, Michael showed up at my house with a folder full of brochures. Alicia was at work, so it was just us. He seemed more determined, more businesslike. "Mom," he started, "I don't want to see you left behind in an old place that might fall apart soon. It's an older house and repairs are only going to get more expensive. I've looked into the local market and it would be really profitable to sell right now. We could all come out on top. Why won't you consider it?" His question stung, but what hurt more was the condescending tone. The subtext was that I was too old or too naive to manage my own affairs. Maybe he thought I wasn't aware of the property's value or that I'd be easily manipulated. I gathered my composure. "I'm not selling. Not now, not soon. And when I do choose to sell, I'll decide that on my own." Michael's face hardened. He said nothing for a few seconds, then turned away. "Fine. Don't say I didn't warn you when the place falls apart under your feet," he muttered. He left without a goodbye hug or even a wave. For a while, I thought that might be the end of it. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing small things. Suspicious phone calls from realtors claiming to have heard I was considering a sale. Letters in the mail from contractors quoting me for roof and plumbing repairs I'd never requested. One day, my phone rang. The man on the line introduced himself as an attorney, saying he had spoken with my son. He asked me straight out if I was aware that, should my health deteriorate, the burden of caring for the house would fall on Michael. He implied that it would be wise to arrange a transfer of ownership now to ease future complications. My chest tightened, fury mingling with betrayal. Michael was trying to corner me, to make me think that staying here was irresponsible and burdensome. I nearly hung up in tears, but I forced myself to remain collected. Not long afterward, I received a text from Michael that read, "Think carefully about what's best for both of us. Alicia and I are serious about starting a family, and we want to offer you security in your old age. Don't be stubborn." That single word, stubborn, enraged me. My refusal to sign over my life didn't make me stubborn. It made me a person with dignity, with a right to live in the home I built and cherish. I replied, "We're done talking about this. Don't contact me about selling the house again." He didn't respond. Weeks went by without any direct communication. Then one morning, I woke up to find my mailbox stuffed with flyers for condominiums around the city, places targeted at seniors on fixed incomes, communities that boasted game nights and on-site doctors. My neighbors reported seeing Michael lurking around the block, sometimes accompanied by Alicia. They were talking to a few realtors who had sold properties in the area. I felt a gnawing sense of dread. Here was my own flesh and blood, scheming and pressuring me to move, all for the sake of convenience and profit. The realization that Michael had become this person, so unrecognizable and cold, left me reeling, but I wasn't about to give in. I decided it was time to confront them directly. One Sunday, I drove to their place. They had moved into a smaller rental after their wedding, apparently biding their time until they could secure something bigger. When I knocked, Alicia answered with a forced smile that didn't mask her annoyance. The living room was cluttered with catalogs for baby furniture, large pictures of dream homes pinned to a corkboard on the wall. A wave of anger coursed through me. The evidence of their plan was scattered about, as though my life had already been laid out for them to manipulate. Michael emerged from the kitchen, eyebrows raised in surprise. "Mom, you should call before dropping in," he said, voice taut. Without preamble, I confronted him. "You're harassing me into selling. It needs to stop, or I promise I'll take legal action." Alicia interjected. "We're trying to help you, not harass you. Why can't you see that?" Her tone was condescending, as though addressing a child. I looked her square in the eyes. "The only person you're helping is yourself," I snapped. Michael tried to calm the situation. "Mom, if we move to a bigger place, you could come live with us if you ever needed help. The community would be safer. You'd be close to us and the grandchildren." I couldn't suppress a bitter laugh. "You just want my house. Let's not pretend otherwise." With every exchange, the rift widened. Eventually, I stormed out, tears burning my eyes as I realized that my own child was prepared to do anything to achieve his dream of a perfect family home, even if it meant sacrificing my wishes. I tried to carry on with my daily life, volunteering at the library, hosting my book club, going to the local farmers market on Saturdays. But the tension gnawed at me. My thoughts were consumed by how easily Michael had tried to manipulate me, how little he cared about my feelings. If he could do that to his own mother, what else was he capable of? Then came the final straw. I received a letter, an official-looking envelope with bold lettering across the top. It said that my property was under consideration for rezoning, meaning it could increase in value even more if sold or subdivided. At first, I thought it was just another pushy marketing scheme, but as I read further, I realized the process had been initiated by a request from a family member, and the city was inquiring if I had any interest in cooperating. My heart hammered against my ribcage. This was Michael's handiwork, or perhaps Alicia's. They'd gone behind my back, contacting the city, forging some claim that we were in agreement about rezoning. The magnitude of that betrayal left me breathless. I spent the next few days poring over legal options. I considered filing a restraining order or a cease and desist, but even if I could legally stop them from harassing me, could I ever truly forgive him? No, I realized, forgiveness was out of the question. My love for Michael was still there, perhaps always would be, but the trust was shattered. He'd become someone who saw me not as his mother, but as a roadblock to a prosperous future, and I couldn't let him win. Deep in the middle of one restless night, I came to a decision. If they wanted to push me out, I'd push back. I'd show them that I wasn't an old, feeble woman waiting to be carted off. I had more resilience than they realized, and I still had a few cards left to play. The next morning, I made calls to a real estate lawyer, to an old friend who worked in the local government, and to a private investigator who specialized in familial disputes and property fraud. Over the next weeks, I started gathering evidence. Every note, every text, every voicemail. I recorded every conversation I had with Michael or Alicia regarding the house. My friend in the local government discreetly looked into who had filed for the rezoning requests. He confirmed my suspicions. The application was filed in Michael's name, but Alicia's signature also appeared on multiple documents. I confronted Michael with proof of his underhanded tactics. I left a message on his phone detailing that I was fully aware of the rezoning request and that I had documentation showing he'd forged my initial consent. I told him point blank that if he continued, I would drag him into court for fraud. He tried calling me multiple times afterward, leaving pleading messages. He tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, claiming he thought he had my verbal approval. That was a lie. I never once suggested I'd sell or subdivide, and the fact that Alicia's name was on the forms spoke volumes. Despite the righteous anger that fueled me, I still felt a hollow ache in my chest every time I remembered the boy I'd raised. Memories of him riding his bike up and down the driveway, shouting for me to watch him, came unbidden. I recalled the night his father died and how Michael clung to me, trembling. I stayed strong though. My love couldn't overshadow the reality that he was trying to undermine me at every turn. As the pressure mounted, I noticed changes in my own behavior. I was losing sleep, snapping at friends, feeling my heart race every time the phone rang. But I refused to let Michael and Alicia see my vulnerability. I pressed forward, determined not to let them tear down the only home I'd known for decades. Eventually, I found an ally in the most unexpected of places, one of the realtors who had initially bombarded me with letters. Her name was Carmen, and she was a sharp, no-nonsense professional who'd gotten fed up with the manipulative vibe Michael and Alicia gave off. She reached out to me with an apology for the spam mail, explaining that Michael had strongly implied I was on board. She saw how the entire scenario reeked of exploitation. Carmen offered to provide written testimony about the false claims Michael made when requesting the promotional materials. With her help, along with my lawyer and the private investigator's notes, I compiled a damning portfolio that made it clear Michael was orchestrating a property grab. I sat on this arsenal of evidence for weeks, waiting for Michael's next move. Alicia had apparently become pregnant. Judging from the social media posts I glimpsed, my neighbor showed them to me as I'd blocked them both online. The posts celebrated the upcoming baby, mentioning how they couldn't wait to live in a bigger home that was perfect for a new family. Alicia's mother even commented about how proud she was that Alicia had found a way to give her child the best neighborhood. Every detail hammered home the realization that they weren't going to abandon their plan, not while they had so much to gain. One Saturday morning, I answered the door to find Michael standing there, eyes red and a bouquet of flowers in hand. He claimed he was there to apologize, to set things right. "Mom, I've been stupid," he said, voice trembling. "I got caught up in all these plans. We're having a baby, and I panicked. I didn't want to disappoint Alicia, but I don't want to lose you either." There was a flicker of remorse in his gaze, and for a moment, the old maternal instinct in me wanted to comfort him. But then I remembered the texts, the phone calls, the city forms forged with my name, and the heartbreak I'd been enduring for months. If he truly wanted to fix things, he would have ended this relentless pursuit long ago. I told him the only way to make amends was to withdraw every rezoning application, to cut off all communication with realtors and attorneys about my property, and to sign a legal document that prohibited him from any future claims on my house. He looked stunned. "Mom, that's a bit extreme," he muttered. "Don't you trust me?" I felt something inside me snap. "No," I said firmly, "not anymore." He tried to protest, but I'd had enough. "I have all the evidence I need to ruin your reputation, to press charges for fraud," I told him. "If you want to avoid that, then you'll do exactly as I say." I saw his face blanch. He struggled to form words. "Mom, Alicia's pregnant. We can't have a scandal like that." He ran his hand over his hair, a habit he'd had since boyhood whenever he was frustrated. "Please, can't we handle this quietly?" I let him sweat for a moment before replying, "Yes, we can handle it quietly, if you comply." He nodded, eyes downcast. A week later, I met him at my lawyer's office. He signed the documents under my attorney's watchful gaze, effectively promising never to contest my ownership, to retract his rezoning request, and to relinquish any claim he thought he had. I handed him a copy of the entire portfolio I had compiled. "If you or Alicia ever come after my home again," I said, "this evidence goes straight to the authorities." He looked defeated, mumbled an apology, and left. If part of me hoped for a tearful reconciliation, it didn't come. I felt no victory in that moment, only grim satisfaction that I'd protected what was mine. I assumed this would be the end of it, that Michael and Alicia would be forced to pursue a legitimate mortgage on a different house, leaving me in peace. Yet, I couldn't shake the sense that something about Alicia's pregnancy and their unwavering determination spelled trouble down the road. My friend from the local government told me that the rezoning application had been withdrawn. The city wouldn't be bothering me anymore, at least not for that reason. I tried to move on, hosting a few gatherings at the house, anything to lift my spirits, but every time I passed Michael's old bedroom, I felt a pang of sadness that threatened to undo me. One evening, months later, I got a call from the hospital. It was Alicia, sobbing. She said Michael had been in an accident. He'd fallen off a ladder while trying to paint a rental property. She claimed he was seriously injured and asked if I could come. My heart clenched. Despite our conflicts, I still loved my son. Without hesitation, I rushed to the hospital. When I arrived, Alicia was standing outside his room, tears streaming down her cheeks. She threw her arms around me, crying about how uncertain everything was. My instincts told me to comfort her, but part of me held back. I remembered how she'd orchestrated so much pain and manipulation. Still, I pushed aside my anger, concerned for Michael's life. Inside the room, I saw him lying there with a bandaged arm and bruises across his face. The doctor said he'd be okay, but he'd need weeks of rehab for a shattered wrist. When Michael opened his eyes and saw me, he started to cry, a weak, unguarded cry. I stepped closer, feeling an odd swirl of protectiveness and anger. "Mom," he whispered, voice cracking. "I'm sorry." Tears blurred my own vision. In that moment, I wanted to believe he'd finally learned something about humility and the value of family. I grasped his hand gently, letting the tears fall. But days later, after he was discharged, he called me from home. He said he and Alicia were facing mounting medical bills, that he'd be unable to work for a while, and that it would really help if I'd consider co-signing a loan or maybe just letting them stay with me temporarily. He laced the request with talk of forgiveness and second chances, making it sound like a heartfelt plea. My stomach sank as I realized the pattern. This was just another angle to exploit me. If I let them move in, they'd slowly start applying pressure again for me to give them the house. or they'd make my life miserable until I caved. I felt my jaw set in resolve. I said, "I'm sorry you're hurt, and I hope you recover quickly, but you can't stay here, and I won't co-sign anything. You made your bed, now lie in it." He sighed heavily, launching into a desperate explanation about Alicia's pregnancy, about how they needed a stable environment for the baby. "There's plenty of rentals," I cut him off. "You'll figure it out." There was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice quivering with anger. "I guess we're done then, Mom," I answered. "Yes, I guess we are." In a world where parent-child bonds are often idealized, I never thought I'd reach a point where I'd have to turn my back on my only son. But betrayal carves wounds that don't heal with mere apologies, and I knew that letting them back in would be tantamount to inviting a fox into the henhouse. I wouldn't do it, no matter how sympathetic I felt regarding his injuries or the baby. For the first time in my life, I put my own well-being before my maternal instincts, and a part of me felt a strange liberation. The months that followed were quiet. I rarely spoke to Michael, and when I did, it was brief and superficial. He never mentioned the house again. Occasionally, I'd hear through neighbors or distant relatives that Alicia gave birth to a baby boy named James, that Michael was able to find a desk job to accommodate his healing wrist, and that they'd moved in with Alicia's mother. The news stung, knowing I wasn't invited to witness my grandson's birth. Yet, I reminded myself that I had lines that couldn't be crossed. Self-respect meant refusing to accept constant manipulation. One evening, as I sat on the back porch, I found myself pondering how drastically life can change. Once, this house was filled with love and laughter. My husband and I had built a future here. Then, after his passing, it was just me and Michael, forging ahead. Now it was just me, alone with my memories. But I didn't feel lonely. Instead, I felt a sense of guarded pride. I'd stood up for myself. I'd refused to be cast aside in favor of someone else's ambitions. Nevertheless, there were days I questioned my actions. Could I have handled it differently? Could I have taught Michael a lesson without severing ties? The answer eluded me, but deep down I suspected that no matter how I approached it, he'd only see dollar signs when he looked at my house. That realization was painful but enlightening. It freed me from the guilt that might otherwise have eaten me alive. Then, out of the blue, I received a subpoena in the mail. Michael and Alicia were suing me for intentional emotional distress and financial harm, claiming that by refusing to sell or help them financially, I'd caused them undue hardship. I stared at the paper, my blood boiling. Was there no limit to how low they'd sink? I immediately called my lawyer. She laughed in disbelief and assured me there was no valid legal basis for such a lawsuit. It was likely just another attempt to pressure me. We'd file the necessary responses and request immediate dismissal. But something inside me snapped. I'd reached the end of my patience. I remembered the portfolio of evidence I'd collected, the recorded conversations, the false rezoning forms with his signature. If they wanted to wage legal warfare, I'd be more than prepared to retaliate. My lawyer and I filed a counterclaim, outlining the fraud, the harassment, and the emotional distress they'd inflicted on me. We included every shred of evidence. The legal system can be slow, but I had faith that facts would prevail. Court dates were set, depositions scheduled. The tension was immense, but a grim determination fueled me. I remember walking into the courthouse, noticing Alicia's glare. She looked haggard, her hair in a hasty bun, dark circles under her eyes. Michael avoided my gaze, but I caught glimpses of him fidgeting in his seat. I felt a pang of pity, but I steeled myself. My lawyer presented our evidence, systematically dismantling their claims. The judge's expression grew sterner with each revelation. The forged documents, the pressure tactics, the manipulative phone calls. Michael tried to claim he'd acted in my best interests, but the judge seemed unconvinced. In the end, they lost. Their suit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile it. My counterclaim was upheld, and the judge ordered them to reimburse me for legal fees and pay damages. It wasn't a fortune, just enough to cover my expenses, but it was a resounding moral victory. As we all left the courtroom, Michael tried to approach me. Alicia tugged at his sleeve, glaring. He stood there, silent, and I walked away. I didn't owe him any comforting words. Betrayal of that magnitude doesn't earn forgiveness, only retribution. That night, I poured myself a cup of tea, sat at my kitchen table, and let out a long, trembling sigh. In many ways, it felt like the final chapter of a conflict I never expected to endure. Sadness mingled with relief. This was my home, the place where memories were forged and dreams once flourished. No matter what happened next, I defended it. I could lay my head down to sleep without regret. I haven't seen Michael since the court hearing. Sometimes, I'm haunted by the thought that he might one day show up on my doorstep, or that Alicia might try another scheme. But for now, the house stands as it always has, quiet, welcoming, and entirely mine. My days are peaceful. I tend my garden, read novels by the fireplace, and chat with my friends. Life moves forward, and so do I. I wish I could say there was a neat, happy ending, but the truth is, we live in a messy world where not every parent-child relationship is salvageable. Mine certainly wasn't, and that's the bittersweet reality. If my son had shown a shred of genuine remorse and given up his relentless pursuit, perhaps we could have salvaged something. But once he chose betrayal and continued pushing, my only recourse was to stand firm. And stand firm I did. Sometimes I recall a younger Michael, the boy who made me a Mother's Day card with macaroni art, or the teenager who asked for my advice on dating. That version of my son seems long gone, replaced by an adult I barely recognize, someone willing to do anything for personal gain. I don't know if or when he'll ever see the error of his ways, and I'm not sure I care anymore. Betrayal leaves scars deeper than most people realize. Yet, life has a way of teaching lessons, even to the most stubborn hearts. If he ever does come around, truly changed, I suppose I'd hear him out. But there won't be a tearful reconciliation or a warm motherly hug. Trust has to be earned, and there are some sins that can't be wiped clean by words. If he wanted unconditional forgiveness, he should have remembered that love and respect go both ways. As it stands, he made his bed, and he can lie in it. I remember an old friend once telling me that home is where the heart is, and that if you don't protect it, you lose part of yourself. I realize now just how right she was. My house isn't just bricks and mortar. It's every memory, every sacrifice, every bit of love I poured into building a safe haven for my family. For my son to treat that as something he could simply take, flip, or discard was an unforgivable betrayal. And so I guard it fiercely, because in guarding my home, I'm guarding my self-respect. I glance out the window now, watching the sunlight dance across the neatly tended garden. The flowers I planted last spring sway gently in the breeze, oblivious to the turmoil that once threatened this sanctuary. I feel a surge of gratitude, not just for the victory in court, but for the clarity of knowing where I stand. I stood up for myself. I refused to be bullied. I realized I was worthy of my own respect. People often say that blood is thicker than water, that family is everything, but I've learned that family can sometimes be the sharpest weapon turned against you. If there's no respect, no genuine love, then the bond is meaningless. The price of family loyalty should never be your sense of self. So, even as I sip my tea and let the weight of the past months roll off my shoulders, I acknowledge the finality of it all. Michael isn't a boy anymore. He made adult choices, and I responded with adult resolve. The sun begins to set, casting a warm glow throughout the living room. Shadows stretch across the hardwood floor. I take one last look around, soaking in the tranquility that's finally returned to my life. My house, my sanctuary, remains mine, unsullied by deceit, protected by the unwavering resolve of a mother who refused to be cast aside. I allow myself a small smile. It's over, I tell myself. And I never surrendered. I stayed right here, in the home that nurtured my family for so many years. Betrayal hurts, but I refuse to let it break me. Now, all that remains is the cool evening air and the lingering scent of honeysuckle drifting through the open window. I breathe deeply, feeling that sweet release that comes from standing one's ground. This is my home, my life, and no one, not even my own son, will ever push me out again.